Picture Japan. Maybe you're thinking of Mount Fuji towering in the distance, framed by cascades of pink cherry blossoms. Perhaps a Buddhist temple perched serenely beside a lake dotted with lotus flowers, ever floating, gliding slightly in the mostly still water. Japan seems nice. It seems calm. It seems peaceful. In the back of our minds, maybe, we know Japan was on the wrong side of World War II. There was Pearl Harbor and all that, but we don't tend to let it taint our views of the country. Japan's fine. We like their culture, we like their food. Japan is fine by us over in the West. But is it possible that's because in our Western-centric minds, we are blissfully unaware of the atrocities Japan actually committed? I'm not talking about Pearl Harbor, folks. I'm talking about unthinkable acts of violence and cruelty towards innocent civilians in neighboring countries. I'm talking about 30 million dead. I'm talking about unethical scientific experimentation. I'm talking about torture. I'm talking about rape. Lots and lots of rape, leaving behind countless women, nameless women, invisible victims, too afraid to utter what happened to them. They called them comfort women, but nothing about being a comfort woman was comfortable. Let's fix that. Hello, I'm LaFountaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I tell surprising true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. A few months ago, back in December, early January, I delved super deep into Japan's involvement in World War II. Talking about the events leading up to the war, the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese internment camps in the U.S., and the Manhattan Project and the first atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. It was really important to me to cover that side of the story because I find we often neglect Eastern history here in the West. I think a lot of people are more knowledgeable about what happened specifically with regards to World War II, what happened in Germany with, Hitler and the Nazis. And maybe that's because, I don't know, I think people feel more connected to stories about people who look like them or people with more similar cultures to their own. I think that's a natural biological thing humans do, sort of grouping together based on similarities. But I don't think, not for 1 second, I don't think that we should neglect to learn about history just because it played out on the opposite side of the world or it involved people who look different and speak differently and live differently. That sort of neglect is dangerous because there are important lessons to be learned there. So I've been personally trying to learn and share more non-Western history because it seems to me to be an area that really needs fixing. We have neglected it in the West, and we got to fix that. So I wanted to return to that world today, the world of World War II era Japan and China. And I really wanted to focus on the victims this time. Back in episode 142 about Pearl Harbor, I talked a lot with my amazing guest, Quinn Cho, about, this general and this battle and that and politics. And that's all super important too. And it's a super interesting episode. If you missed it, go back and listen to that one for sure. But this time around, I want to focus on the people that have been mostly forgotten, the victims. And it being Women's History Month, of course, I decided to hone in on the female victims of Japan's atrocities during that time. Women called comfort women who were forced into sexual slavery, essentially, to benefit the Japanese army. And because I'm admittedly not an expert on Eastern history, I've recruited a special guest, once again, to help me tell this very important story.
My name is Jenny Chan, and I'm the director of Pacific Atrocities Education. And I know that you've had Quinn on the show before.
Yes, it was awesome. So knowledgeable. It was great. Just a wealth of knowledge. Jenny and Quinn both work for Pacific Atrocities Education, a nonprofit organization based in California with a mission of raising awareness about Japan's often overlooked war crimes during and in the years leading up to World War II. Jenny has also written a historical novel called The Undrowning Lotus that is based on a true story. And in writing that book, she interviewed survivors, women who served as these comfort women and were lucky enough to survive and also brave enough to tell their stories. So she's really the perfect person to enlighten us about this very dark part of history. And just trigger warning, some of what you're going to hear in this episode is hard to hear. We're going to talk about some extremely shocking things, things that may not be appropriate for young audiences. So please keep that in mind. Also, I have links to both the Pacific Atrocities Education website and to Jenny's book, The Undrowning Lotus, in the description of this episode, in case you want to learn more. You might want to, because I promise this one is going to be hard to stop thinking about. Anyway, let's get into it. You know, I love the topic that we're here to talk about today because it's so perfectly history fix. It's something I didn't know anything about. And, since you kind of suggested it, I've read a couple articles, but I'm really looking forward to you enlightening me further. So can you just tell me a little bit about Chinese comfort women during World War II?
Yeah, so a lot of people have heard about Korean comfort women, but Chinese comfort women was also a thing. In fact, the first military conscribed sexual slavery military brothel was in Shanghai after 1932, the Shanghai incident. A lot of soldiers were caught raping women, and so they were thinking that, well, if we were going to if our soldiers are raping women, we might as well create something that is systematic for them and is military controlled. And that is their solution of military sexual violence, which is quite shocking. And it's kind of ironic, isn't it, that their only way to fight sexual violence is with more sexual violence itself.
Right. It seems like the way to fix one atrocity is by committing another atrocity, but almost like a government sanctioned one. It's almost worse in some ways, right? Because it's yeah, almost more acceptable or something, which it of
It's
course isn't.
Yeah, it's more like a legal thing, and they the Japanese government at the time kind of justified it by saying that it was a wartime logistical policy. And it's really rooted to serve the soldiers who were already very upset about serving this war. And so then that's why if you see a lot of the comfort women documents from the National Archives, our organization has digitized about 1 million pages from World War II, and onto our digital archive. And if you look into the digital archive, into the National Archives, a lot of these comfort women were just amenities. It's almost like it's a side note of history.
Mhm.
We imagine wars of generals and battles, but then we don't imagine what women have gone through in the war. And so it's it's an interesting thing, and it's very shocking too, because not only were they amenities, they were also used as tools to kind of stopping sexual violence. But you can see during rape of Nanking, it really didn't do anything because so many women were raped in 1937 during the rape of
Mhm.
Nanking. But in their justification, they said that these comfort stations are meant to control soldiers, reduce backlash, and manage disease that they would get from but it just, I mean, it just institutionalized this kind of sexual slavery in
Right.
during the war. And it's very fascinating because in Korea, Like in the US media, we always think that Korea and Japan are like friends, but like every Wednesday, there were even when I was visiting Korea, there's ongoing protests in front of Japanese embassy
Oh, wow.
every Wednesday, and like my
Wow.
Airbnb host invited me to go and like protest. I'm like, wow, it's a Wednesday,
Wow.
and it's that kind of scar that Japan has with its neighbors that's like not healing because people still remember what they did in World War II.
Yeah. I remember talking with Quinn Cho about I never know if is it Nanking or Nanjing? Do you know like what the are those both
Yeah,
Nan,
Nanjing is
Nan
more like a pinyin, and
okay.
Nanking was more older style of calling it.
Okay. I remember touching on that massacre and sometimes it's called the rape of Nanking or Nanjing and I still am just like traumatized from just learning. I didn't really know a whole lot about that until talking to Quinn Cho, and I still think about it. I find myself thinking about it all the time, and just how absolutely horrific that was. I know I've mentioned the rape of Nanking and the Nanking massacre several times now, but in case you're just now joining me for the first time, this was an event during the Second Sino-Japanese War that preceded World War II, in which the Japanese Imperial Army invaded Nanking or Nanjing, the then capital city of China, and proceeded to rape and brutally murder just anyone they could get their hands on. We're talking civilians, men, women, children, the elderly, anyone. It's one of the most horrifying acts of brutality I've yet to come across in my own pursuit of historical knowledge. If you find yourself on the Nanjing Massacre Wikipedia page, by the way, please proceed with caution, as the photos that they have there are super graphic and like difficult to view. But having that small bit of context, knowing how many women were raped in Nanking, I had to ask: Do you feel like rape was a big part of that? There were some tens
Yes.
of thousands of women raped during that, um, among other atrocities. But do you feel like that influenced? Did they set up more of these comfort houses or these comfort stations afterwards, or were they already happening before that? I'm wondering how influential that was.
They already set it up in 1932,
Okay.
and that was like the first incident that China and Japan, well, one of the first incident, that's like 5 years before, the rape of Nanking. And if you think about it too, it's shocking because Korea was handed to Japan by Teddy Roosevelt after the Treaty of Portsmouth. So one can only imagine what kind of a violence that Korea had to go through.
Okay, pause. What's Ted doing meddling in Korea? So the Treaty of Portsmouth officially ended the Russo-Japanese War that was fought in 1904-1905 between, you guessed it, Russia and Japan. So this was over Russia trying to expand its territory in East Asia, as if Russia isn't big enough already. Japan won this war, forcing Russia to stop expanding into Asia, and actually became the first Asian power, in modern times at least, to defeat a European power. So this treaty was sort of brokered by U.S. President Theodore, aka Teddy Roosevelt. Why? Why was the US involved in the Russo-Japanese War? Well, they weren't actually part of that war at all. The US, if you haven't caught on yet, just likes to meddle in other countries' business whenever possible, regardless of the consequences. Not like to help other people, though, usually, mostly to protect US interests overseas, as was the case here. So anyway, Teddy Roosevelt brokers the treaty, which essentially gives Korea to Japan, which will, of course, have all sorts of consequences. He more or less threw lambs into a lion's den by doing this. But, don't worry. Ted got a Nobel Peace Prize for it in 1906. He was actually the first American to win a Nobel Prize for his negotiation skills in ending the Russo-Japanese War. Did anyone bother to ask Korea to weigh in? Of course not.
And it's also insane to me that like we post on Instagram and like there are still people denying what happened.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you that, like, what has Japan's response as a country, have they really I mean, I assume they've acknowledged it, have they, like, apologized formally or, like, paid any reparations to any of the survivors that you know of? What's Japan's stance on it today?
Yeah, so that's very fascinating and it's a very long story. So in 2014, I visited one of the comfort women in Shanxi, and her name was John Xian Tu, and her she went to court in like the 1990s with Japan, and ultimately they agreed that it happened, but never paid a reparation for
Mhm,
it. And then in the 2000s, I think they also established like this Asian Women Fund, but the payment for the Korean Comfort Women was so minimal that
mm,
there was like a video online of these Korean comfort women, calling their Korean prime minister a sellout for agreeing to this compensation
mhm,
because it was so low, and it's almost like humiliating.
mm,
And it's also interesting because like a lot of these survivors, because in Asia it's sexual violence is such a taboo topic. I
mhm,
feel like that they don't talk about it outright until they're super, like they're very old, and they it's like something that they want to get off their chest,
right.
before. Yeah.
I imagine for a long time yeah, I mean, especially if culturally it's not really spoken of, you wouldn't wanna just, like, come out and admit what had happened to you. There's probably a lot of, like, shame, and it would be hard to talk
Yeah.
about. Yeah.
Yeah, in
Yeah.
2014, I went to Shanxi to like interview a bunch of them, and a bunch of them like I interviewed them in 2015. It took me 2 years to write the book because of like how emotionally heavy it was for me.
Yeah.
And one of the she was swept up in like the 1942. So like during one of the bigger like anti-guerrilla fighters in northern China, and she lived in like basically in those, it was like a cave for that
Mm.
like little comfort station, and she was basically raped like daily for like a year, and like 10 to 15 like uh rape like happening a day.
Oh my god. That's
And she was just like, and then afterward she was pregnant, because I guess some people didn't use protection, or didn't, it failed and whatever. And she was telling me that after the war, like her mom and her went to like a cave nearby and buried that baby alive, and like just
Mhm.
never thought about it again. So it's not just like, it's one victim, you have like this lineage of victims. And then her mom told her, oh, don't ever tell anyone about this because, it's just too embarrassing. And so she didn't talk about that until like the 1980s and the 1990s, until she's like older, because she wanted to have like, when she was younger, I guess she wanted to have more of a future. And you don't want to talk about that like when you're younger, and like it's like a taboo topic.
Mhm.
And yeah, so it's just like an emotionally heavy, like traumatic experience that happened between like Japan and this neighboring country. And it's
Mhm.
not just like Chinese, also like there were also like the Dutch Indies were also colonized. And forgot this woman's name, Jan. She has a book about her experience as a Japanese comfort woman, and she also didn't talk about it until like well after the war. And she even wrote a book about it. And she was Dutch, and her family were in the Dutch Indies. And she described how it was like serving so many men in like one day, and yeah.
How did they, so I know there were Chinese women and Korean women and even from, other places, but how did they acquire these women? Like, was this something I mean, I assume they didn't, like, sign up willingly for it. Was this a how did they get the women to be
Yeah.
part of this?
So Korea was one of the largest sources, because Korea was a colonial, like I would say it was kind of a colonial infrastructure. And so a lot of the women living in like rural Korea, they weren't like so they weren't really well off. So then the Japanese government would say something like, "Oh, we're recruiting women to be dishwashers, nurses, and whatever," promising some high-paying jobs,
Mm.
and then they just take them and and they end up being comfort women instead of like being dishwashers or nurses or maid that they were promised to be. And then I realized that when I was going through some of the documents and going through that there were also different tiers of comfort women. So, for example, there were like geisha and like prostitutes type that would come from Japan and they would like serve the higher ranking like general.
Yeah.
And then the Koreans would probably serve like, the mid-tier soldiers and then like whoever that they abduct from military operation in the local area, those would serve like the infantrymen and like the lower tier of soldiers. And so it's a tier system. And it is interesting because like we always think about uh, war in like people who dressed up in uniform, they go to battlefields, but then we don't think about like the consequences and what happened to like the victims of war. And going back to the rape of Nanking, it's so shocking that even like a Nazi, John Rabe, um wrote to Germany and was like, I can't believe our friends are doing this in China right now. And like he covered his building in swastika to try to save like women and children.
Wow.
And
That's pretty bad if Nazis are calling you out. That's
yeah,
pretty
it's
bad.
very bad. And so yeah,
Wow.
it's just like, and it's interesting too because like, nowadays, I mean, this has happened to me like multiple times now. Like, post about comfort women on our Instagram page is like very scary for me
Yeah.
because like these people are like, oh, there are a lot of deniers out there that disagree about what happened, and they would say something like, "Oh, this didn't happen. They were looking for jobs and blah blah blah." Or they would be like, "Oh, they had child bride system, and we were trying to liberate them." Like I've seen all kinds of excuses like
Yeah.
throughout my our social media life that it's interesting. Like it's so crazy to me too because now the Japanese Takaichi just won a landslide victory, the LDP, and the LDP was actually founded by a Class A war criminal, Kishinobusuke. Well, he came up with economic policy and a lot of the policies regarding like wartime Japan, and that's why he was captured at the end of the war, and he was allegedly a Class A war criminal.
Mm.
Some of the other things that he did was like in Manchuria, he captured like the Japanese captured 4 million slave laborers,
Yeah.
and like 40% died right away from like hardship. And and it's so after the war, um he was in Sugamo prison, and he even had there's even a whole memoir about that. And but then the whole Asia was supposedly falling to communism. And so Eisenhower and the CIA took him out of Sugamo prison and knew that he knows how Japanese politics worked and had him basically become prime minister within 10 years of being a war criminal.
Wow.
And he established the LDP party, and his grandson was Shinzo Abe, which I'm pretty sure was assassinated like a few years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the LDP party just won in a landslide, which is and this is the kind of party that also this current prime minister also was a frequent visitor of Yasukuni Shrine, which like it's kind of like idolizing Japanese war criminals. And so if
Wow.
you think about it, it's just like not only are they not like, can you imagine if Nazis were or like Germany suddenly decided to have a shrine for war criminals, class A war criminals, how that would look for
Right.
like how that
Mhm.
yeah.
Oof. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I even think about it because I live in the American South, and I even think about it with some of these, like, Confederate, war memorials and sort of, glorifying, Robert E. Lee and some of the Confederate generals who, really fought to continue to enslave people in this country, and how there's been more sort of, people are starting to realize more and more how, maybe we shouldn't have this statue glorifying this guy who fought for this really unjust thing. But yeah, that's even, a Nazi version or like in Japan, it's like, yeah, it's a little distasteful. I feel like it's a little, yeah, it's not a
Yeah,
good
and
look.
it's just very uncomfortable too for
Yeah.
like other people, like their neighboring country, and that's why I think Korea is continuing to have their protests every Wednesday. And in the Philippines, they had a comfort women statue. But because of how Japan had paid for a lot of the Philippines infrastructure and contribute economically, that they basically said that let's take it down. We can't have this comfort woman statue. Let's not remember what they did
Wow.
during the
Oh,
war. So
that's
it's like a
filthy.
lot of this like economic and political like issues as well.
Yeah. But, we talked about how these women didn't want to talk about it and they didn't wanna admit, and part of that was this cultural thing, but that really facilitates it makes it possible for them to kinda sweep it under the rug and pretend like it didn't happen. You wonder if it took place in a different culture where it was less taboo and where the women felt more comfortable sort of telling what happened to them, as victims. You wonder if they would have had to take more accountability. So it's like this perfect storm of, like, we don't talk about it in this culture, and that has led to them sort of being able to almost get away with it. They really haven't. If they're still protesting every Wednesday, it's like clearly this is still an issue. That we haven't not resolved this. Um, so that's
A-
really
And if you
sad.
and if we think about it too, like the 200 like women, the estimate of the 200,000 women who were coerced into comfort stations, right? Like these are the women who were accounted for.
Mhm.
Throughout the Pacific, like 30 million people died. So there are like villages that got like looted and then like it was like mass killing and then just burned down all the evidence. So what happened to the woman there? We never know and we will never know what happened. And in fact, it was so brutal that I mean, you can see some of the OSS documents of like how they describe like the Japanese atrocities. It was so brutal that it's shocking. And so with all these mass graves and whatnot, you can't even account for what happened to women outside of the comfort stations. And so I think it's like inside and outside of the comfort station that, had all these sexual violence on women.
Yeah, it almost seemed, I mean, they're so objectified, like, they seem like these commodities, and it's so dehumanizing, and I think about it just in calling them comfort women, like, they were not comfortable at all. Certainly, the comfort isn't referring to them, it's the comfort of the men, and even just the name comfort women, it really emphasizes how much the concern was on the men and the well-being of the men, and do they have what they need, and no one's thinking about these women, no one's worrying about their needs and their comfort. So even just the name to me is so telling of sort of the mentality that goes into that kind of thing. And I imagine now it's been so long. I imagine there aren't many survivors still alive. I mean, they would be quite old. We're
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm glad I did the interview in like the 2010s when I did
yeah.
it. And it was also shocking that like because one of the Harvard professor I'm pretty sure he still is sponsored by Mitsubishi, which is like one of the Japanese corporation in Harvard. They sponsor Harvard professorship apparently,
Hmm.
and he did like and that professor did a whole video about how these comfort women were just prostitutes during like World War II. I'll send it to you later, but it's so
Yeah.
bizarre. I forgot his name. But yeah, people were just like outraged by his claim. And then that's how I realized that apparently a lot of these like academic chairs are also, sponsored by corporations, or sometimes they have their own political agenda.
Mm. Wow. It's just like it goes deep. Yeah, you kind of spiral when you start thinking about that stuff. I did read in one of the articles that I kind of glanced over. It mentioned that U.S. soldiers may have even used these comfort houses, like after the war, but up until like 1946. I think they didn't like shut them down. They were still operating. Do you know anything about U.S. involvement there?
I don't. I haven't done any research into that, but it would not surprise me, to be honest with
Yeah.
you. Like, given U.S. occupation of Japan, there was, and that's the kind of thing that, like, when men go into war, like, we don't tell the kind of untold stories about what happens after or during, you know?
Mm.
And it's like there's such a chaotic wartime system that we don't really know precisely what happened. Like, we still don't know the precisely how many comfort women there were.
Right. Do you know, like, what I mean, I know obviously they were being abused daily. Do you know, like, what the living conditions were like there? Accommodate were they fed well? Did they have, like, a comfortable place to sleep? I mean, do you know what it was like in those comfort
Yeah,
stations for
so
the women?
when I was interviewing one of the women, she said no, basically, because you're just basically being raped repeatedly 10 to 15 times. So she just closed her eyes and pretended that she wasn't even there.
Mhm.
And like she had maybe like a meal a day if she can even eat, because it's like not even appetizing. Like
Right.
who could be eating
Yeah.
while going through that kind of living condition, right? But I suppose that if it was like a higher tier comfort woman, maybe. But I recently read a memoir by like the so-called higher tier um Japanese comfort woman. I don't think she was living that great of a life either.
Mhm.
It's just all very sickening. It exposes really what war can do like to people.
It feels very animal, it's like very, like we're killing and we're raping. It's like we've gone back to this animalistic, way of being almost, like it brings out the worst the worst in humans. But it makes sense, like you said, we don't really find out a lot of what these soldiers go through. Like they're witnessing these horribly traumatic. They're killing people and they're seeing people blown apart and they're losing friends and it's just this horrible thing, war, right? So when you're in that, it's probably easy to justify doing one more horrible thing. It's like it's a different reality. But it's a shame that the women have been so victimized in those instances, and that like you said, we don't even know how many, and we don't really know. We haven't really been able to talk about it. It's like this untold story that holds so many important lessons that needs to be told. So I love that you've been able to interview some. That's amazing that you've been able to actually interview some of these women and get their stories. It's so important.
And can I say something else? So I was looking into like Unit 731. This is what we do most of our research in, because it's now like so complete with like our data set. And it's so shocking to me how they do like human experimentation. Like they would force a pregnant woman to contract syphilis by another male like prisoner that they have already given syphilis
Mm.
to see if it will infect a baby. And that's the level of like cruelty, I think, of
Mhm.
this level of brutality. And
Yeah.
Unit 731 was like a human experimentation camp run by Ishishiro near Harbin, China, in Manchuria, when they captured Manchuria. Um, and like a lot of those, I mean, the prison, there was no survivor. So you don't even know what they go through. But then like you can read some accounts of like what the Japanese scientists they were doing. And it's, how do I state this? They kind of justify what they were doing. just by saying like, "Oh, this is going to further science advancement," and it was not just like one or two scientists who had gone rogue. We're talking about like thousands of scientists at this time who have gone rogue. And we have lesson plans about like what happens when there's no ethics
Mhm.
in science. And I think that's why the humanities is so important. I think that's why what you do is so important, like history fix, because like what is science without the humanities?
Right.
And so and what is like what is never again if the first time was really never told? And
Exactly.
with a lot of this, like, evidence being destroyed, that were destroyed, whatever we found are just, like, by the luck of chance that these
Mhm.
documents survive because between surrendering and occupation, there were a whole 2 weeks, that they can have. It's not like with the Nazis where Americans were, like, right on the grounds right away. So there's still a lot of gap of the stories that we're trying to tell, and that's why I think it's more and it's more important than ever. Like when we go to the National Archives, a lot of the pages are now in like very fragile conditions because during World War II they used like whatever they could grab to make paper, and so it's like
Mhm.
onion peel paper or like by compound material. Even the Civil War, like it's in a more um better condition because it was more cotton bound paper.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's just yeah, it's just it's just when I was reading all of these like documents, I'm like the human psychology, like, the human mind is actually very weak, maybe these were ethical people, and then when I was reading the Sugamo prisoners and, like, how the villagers are trying to, like, have all these other, testify for these people who were so-called innocent, the villagers are like, "No, he's a very good, village doctor, he means very well, he's very nice to everyone." But then you read the war crimes, like atrocities, you're like, wow, this is actually this guy, during the war had totally gone out of his way to kill people. It's
Yeah.
insane.
It's hard to
Yeah.
make sense of, because like, good and evil become these very confusing things because, people are saying he's a good guy, and but then you look at what these people are doing and you're like, "Well, that's not a good guy." So it's hard to make sense of, and like you said, during war, you can't justify it, but it's almost like people become so desensitized by all of these horrible things that are happening that they almost are able to justify to themselves committing these things. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's hard to make sense of for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I've been doing this for 10 years, and like sometimes I'm just like, wow, this is like another thing that is just so creepy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think here in the US at least, I think people are pretty aware of the atrocities committed by like Nazi Germany and the Holocaust and all that. I don't think people are as aware of the Pacific atrocities, so I love that you're bringing that to light. I think we tend to focus on more Western history and Western issues here, and this is really more of an Eastern issue, Eastern history. So I think it's lesser known than what was happening in, like, the European front of the war, but really, like, I don't wanna say more shocking or it's not, like, certainly not worse, but, like, really horrific. It's really, really
Yeah,
shocking.
we can't compare atrocities, but
Right.
we also can't look at the world in such a Western-centric lens that
Mhm.
we, ignore all of the other sufferings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, so I love that you are shedding light on this and on the stories of these women, and you mentioned, so you interviewed those women for your book, was that correct?
Yes, it's
I
called And
oh,
Drowning Lotus, and because I picked that name because lotus is such it's like, it always floats no matter what happens to them,
oh,
and
I love
so
that.
So then for these people, it was almost like when I was listening to their stories, it almost felt like they're resilient and they're always
Yeah.
floating no matter what had happened to them. And it's just like about that resilience. I mean, if that was happening to me, I don't know what I would do,
Yeah.
So
Unthinkable. I mean, Yeah.
Yeah.
Unthinkable is a good word for it. After our conversation, something Ginny said really stuck with me. She said, quote, "What is never again if the first time was really never told?" End quote. And that just gives me chills because it's everything. It's the whole mission of History Fix. It's the whole mission of Pacific Atrocities Education. We have to tell these stories. We have to tell the story of a nameless, faceless Chinese woman who lived on the other side of the world almost a century ago. We have to tell her story because she matters. Because if no one knows what happened to her, if no one knows what she went through and how much she suffered, then how can we be sure it won't happen again? An undrowning lotus. She floats through it all, and so it's easy to overlook her suffering. But don't confuse resilience with complacency. It's hard to hear. It's painful, these stories. It's so much more comfortable to say, oh, that didn't happen. They were prostitutes. They chose to do that. They chose to be there. Wouldn't that be nice? To assume these women had some kind of agency, some control, that they weren't the victims of human weakness, of cruelty and brutality that harkens back to an animalistic, uncivilized sort of savagery. It would be comfortable to delude ourselves into thinking that humans, that men, soldiers, generals, whatever, that they weren't capable of this sort of savagery. That would be more comfortable. But if there's anything this story of comfort women has taught us, it's that comfort is a rather subjective term. We need to be uncomfortable hearing these stories. We need to understand what we are capable of, to fear it, because only then can we actively prevent it from happening again. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting, and maybe you even learned something new. As always, source material for this episode can be found in the show notes. Be sure to follow my Instagram @HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix.